Good afternoon and welcome to ICCR's webinar on renewable solutions, offshore wind, and a just transition. My name is Christina Herman and I coordinate the work of investors on the climate crisis at the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility. ICCR is a coalition of some 300 global faith and values-based institutional investors representing over $2 trillion in assets under management that engage the world's largest corporations on social and environmental issues affecting communities in the US and globally. Our understanding that justice must be at the heart of the changes needed to address the climate crisis has spurred us to explore ways that we can ensure a just transition as we shift to a clean energy economy. To make the massive shifts needed with the urgency required, we believe the transition must take into consideration the concerns and needs of everyone affected, particularly the most vulnerable. The deployment and expansion of renewable energy technologies, especially the power generated by offshore wind, will play an integral role in reducing our collective carbon footprint. And these projects also hold out the promise of good jobs for decades to come. This webinar, which we're co-hosting with New England for Offshore Wind, Series, and Climate Finance Action, will give an overview of the role offshore wind can play in creating a just transition and the policies needed to ensure racial equity, environmental justice, and high-road jobs. The webinar will look at initiatives underway in the Northeast US and specific policies needed to ensure a rapid, just development of offshore wind power and that apply to wind development and just transition initiatives broadly. So we have 5 speakers today, starting with Laura Devaney from Boston Trust Walden, who will give an investor perspective on the importance of net zero commitments by energy utilities, accompanied by a roadmap that ensures a just transition. Susanna Hatch with the Environmental League of Massachusetts will walk us through the potential of offshore wind for clean energy production and the status of offshore wind development in New England and along the East Coast of the United States. Hillary Bright with the Blue-Green Alliance, a coalition of labor unions and major environmental groups, will address the issue of how offshore wind development can be guided by comprehensive labor standards. Tamika Jacques, Director of Workforce Development at the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center, will speak to how offshore wind development can address racial justice and benefit low-income and local communities. And to wrap up the presentations, John Carlson from Ceres, the Boston-based sustainability NGO, will talk about the importance of policy for a just transition and specific opportunities for investors to weigh in. I want to thank the presenters for their willingness to share their perspectives and expertise with us today. All speakers have offered to make their emails available for follow-up questions, and their contact information will be available in a slide at the close of the webinar. Before I turn this over to our first speaker, I want to offer just a few housekeeping points. This webinar is being recorded and everyone will receive a follow-up email with a link to the recording and contact emails for the speakers. You will be in listen-only mode throughout the webinar. We will hear from each one of our speakers and then we'll have about 10 to 15 minutes after the presentations for questions. Please enter your questions in the Q&A box, not in the chat. And you can do that at any time during the webinar. And now I'll hand the mic over to Laura Devaney from Boston Trust Walden, who will get us started with an investor perspective on the importance of high-road jobs and a just transition. Welcome, Laura.
Thank you, Christina, and hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. So yeah, I am Laura Devaney, Senior ESG Research Analyst at Boston Trust Walden. Our firm is a private employee-owned investment management firm with over $11 billion in assets under management. Our clients include institutional investors spanning pension funds, faith-based institutions, foundations, and the like, as well as private wealth clients. We have a pretty long history of incorporating ESG factors into our investment decision-making process, and we also have a very long history of active ownership, where we work to strengthen ESG-related policies, practices, and accountability through shareholder engagement with portfolio companies. So we conduct our shareholder engagements both directly and collaboratively through investor advocacy groups like ICCR, which is comprised of faith-based and values-based investors, as well as series initiatives like the Climate Action 100 and others. And this brings us here today. Also, I should note, on a personal matter, I live in the North Shore of Massachusetts, and I'm a member of the Salem Alliance for the Environment. So some of the local leaders and members of that group have been very active in exploring and educating the local community on potential benefits relating to offshore wind in the Gulf of Maine, which has been exciting to track. So jumping in, I'll start by painting a very, very concise picture of what investors are seeing right now. Some of this will be obvious, especially if you've been paying attention to all this, but I think it'll help little preliminary stage setting, right? So what do we see? We see that climate science tells us that we're in a very precarious position. The world needs to achieve real atmospheric emission reductions as soon as possible. We also know the electric utility sector is broadly responsible for a third of greenhouse gas emissions in the US. And we know that decarbonization of the electric utility sector also offers the ability to really decarbonize other sectors, including transportation sector, which, as we know, from recent commitments, might have a little uptick, needed uptick in the move to EVs. We also know we have some renewed US leadership. The Biden-Harris administration has already called for carbon neutrality or 100% clean energy or clean electricity by 2035, which is a pretty significant policy signal in the here and now. So what else do we see? We see a good number of electricity companies and other heavy emitting industries are developing net zero plans. There are varying degrees of ambition, and there's still plenty of other companies that still need to move and pick up the pace. But no matter what decarbonization pathways these companies might be exploring, we know that their plans are inevitably going to impact ratepayers, communities, and workers. So from an investor perspective, that inevitably makes us look at it as both a set of risks and opportunities. I'll say that some of the risks thematically go into kind of three buckets. I'm sure there's more, and some of these are kind of cross-sectional. One is reputational and stakeholder risks. What kind of public challenges are utilities going to face from workers, community activists, ratepayers, and the like? Kind of looking at different political, or I should say more public policy related risks. Utilities are heavily regulated. There's a lot of different stakeholder pressures to drive public policy in different directions, particularly around decarbonization goals. So watching a lot of that play out. And then systemic risks. Depending on the clip at which the low carbon transition, the energy transition moves, it's going to continue to reshape some economic activity. And so what's the interplay of that with both the companies, but also the workers and the communities that are impacted by that shift? So particularly now in the wake of the pandemic, we know that the energy transition is going to continue. Responsible investors in particular know it's pretty critical for all of us to work together to ensure that this transformation really unfolds in a just and equitable way. And I think what we're starting to see is that investor engagements in the electric utility sector are emerging and have the potential to emerge more as a real test case for how a managed transition might be borne out in a given industry. Zooming in a little bit, relevant to the offshore wind topic today, I think investors are seeing how offshore wind technologies are becoming more readily available and cost effective. That includes some prospects for offshore wind projects in the Gulf of Maine. Offshore wind is part of the opportunity set, clearly, in addressing the climate crisis. I think we see the interplay of opportunities that racial equity, environmental justice, and some high road jobs may come into play with offshore wind projects. And I think particularly relevant to many of the folks who are speaking and listening to this webinar today, Massachusetts really has the opportunity to play an important part in kind of being a proving ground for how the sector and regional policymakers can play in integrating just transition principles into company action plans and policies. So we want to see a lot more of that kind of discussion be increased and accelerated. I think kind of looking at companies that might be looking to prioritize local communities and workforces in the transition. There's kind of two overarching questions that I'll highlight. One is, you could think of it if you're an investor or another stakeholder, like, wanting to know what the company may be considering. You say, what are the workforce and community concerns that are being integrated into board level oversight of, how the company is navigating the clean energy transition. And, if the workforce and community related just transition concerns are being, integrated into board level oversight, what is the company considering, or is it planning to make any specific commitments with regard to providing decent work, access to jobs for marginalized communities, support for workers and communities that might be negatively affected by this transformation? And I think here, this again is like, what's the project potential, the positive community and worker impact potential of offshore wind projects? So, there are definitely examples of deeper questions that you can dig into. There's a lot of really great guidance that's been published by ICCR series and some other groups that have been focusing on what these kind of stakeholder engagements and these just transition specific dialogues could dig into. So I'll highlight just a couple of those without getting too much further into the weeds. So other questions for the company might be along the lines of, how is the company engaging stakeholders across workforce and community concerns, but definitely environmental, biodiversity impacts throughout, project planning process? How might the company be adopting responsible contracting policies or designing its own framework for making sure that clean energy projects and related procurement kind of deliver on promises for good jobs, economic opportunity, worker and community level? I think there's some questions around definitely, like to what degree might the company or the regional sector be actively helping to develop and advocate for workforce investment, focusing and prioritizing underserved communities, workers of color, and definitely looking for potential risks or job disruptions that might have that conventional workers may face. As the transition continues, how might a conventional, electricians or pipe fitter role be displaced or transformed and repurposed for alternative projects? So I know that's a theme that's been coming up a little bit more and more, and I think those might be some of the more complicated or challenging discussions to be had, but it's a thing that's out there. I'll just underscore one additional and pretty important company question that definitely plays into just this whole question of just transition, and what types of stakeholders the company may be prioritizing within its own policy advocacy at the state, regional, and national levels. Really, like especially now in the here and now, investors are asking more and more for transparency around how a company is prioritizing its public policy so that the company's values, if they support the Paris Agreement, if they support, net zero goals, and they have, particularly if they have a net zero by 2050 or 2040 or whatever target articulated, we want to see the clear connections between what the company's, direct decarbonization goals are, but also how it is lending its corporate voice in public policy spheres. And particularly relevant to this webinar, I mean, how is there's an extension of that where, we're going to increasingly want to hear more and more about how a company may or may not be prioritizing worker and community interests within some of that public policy and advocacy. I'll just end with a few parting thoughts and then pass it off. I would say, the collective we see opportunities for companies to definitely navigate their net zero pathways and implement their decarbonization projects while also addressing equity issues. I think there's clear opportunities and kind of a burden of responsibility to bear here. the reality is, and these aren't going to be always going to be easy dialogues, whether it be the investor talking to the company engaging with the stakeholders, something being even more collaborative. There's a couple different engagement models that are unfolding within this theme, but I think we all have to work through, as different stakeholders, having different goals, different organizing principles, pre-existing relationships that might have been collaborative or adversarial, things like that. I think we need to continue to be very forward-looking, all earnestly commit to working together, and ensure that any barriers to resistance or barriers to action to continue this clean energy transition are minimized. So there's great tools out there, great resources from ICCR, series, and other groups that are percolating around this theme. And so I just encourage folks to really tool up, read the reports, and definitely reach out to many of the good folks on this webinar who I know want to be a resource as we all advocate for the issue. So I'll pass it back to Christina and say thanks.
Great, thanks very much, Laura. That was terrific. And I love the way you connected the dots on all the issues that we need to be paying attention to as we're trying collectively to build, take advantage of this opportunity. We have to decarbonize, but we've seen also that to decarbonize, we need to do that in a just and equitable manner, or else we're not going to get where we need to go. And, so it's good for people, and it's what we need. I want to turn the webinar now over to Susanna Hatch, who's with the Environmental League of Massachusetts, who's going to walk us through the potential of offshore wind and what's happening along the East Coast of the US. So, Susanna, floor is yours.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Christina. My name is Susanna Hatch, and I am the Clean Energy Coalition Director at the Environmental League of Massachusetts, as well as the regional lead for the New England for Offshore Wind Coalition. Thank you all for being here today. Clearly, there's a lot of interest in the role offshore wind can play in creating a fair economy and a just transition to clean energy. Oops, sorry, let me just go back for a second. New England for Offshore Wind is a growing regional coalition of 75 organizations, including environmental advocacy organizations, academic and research institutions, justice and health organizations, business alliances, and labor unions. We believe that offshore wind is the single biggest lever that we can pull to reduce our emissions, address the climate crisis, meet our energy needs, and grow our economy simultaneously, all while protecting ratepayers, creating high-quality jobs, and improving public health by reducing pollution. We aim to drive governors and legislatures to support regional collaboration and more offshore wind procurements, building the political will to power every home in New England with responsibly developed offshore wind by the mid-2030s. I'll take a few minutes to explain why we are focused on offshore wind in particular. First, from a climate perspective, offshore wind is likely to be the workhorse for our decarbonization efforts here in New England. We'll need to bring significant new clean energy online in order to meet our goals. Offshore wind is not the only piece of the puzzle. We'll need other renewable resources, including solar, storage, and energy efficiency to reach our goals, but it is the biggest piece of the renewable energy puzzle in New England. Analyses, including this one from the Brattle Group, show that offshore wind will likely provide around 50% of our region's power by 2050. The technical potential of offshore wind off of New England is more than 10 times our current electricity demand, and New England is uncommonly well positioned to harness this potential. We have a dense population with high energy demand close to shore. The wind off our coast is stronger than almost anywhere in the world, and it is strongest and most consistent in the winter when we'll most need the energy for heating. And the shallow water on our continental shelf is ideal for building turbines. And finally, the economic potential of offshore wind in New England is astounding. This industry presents an enormous economic opportunity for New England. We're talking about a potential $100 billion of private capital marshaled between now and 2050. Imagine what it could mean for our economy if we attracted some of that economic investment to our shores. A new industry of this scale has ripple effects throughout the economy. These benefits will be increased if policymakers make big offshore wind commitments, sending a strong market signal that will drive economic investment in a local supply chain. The industry will drive research and innovation of new technology, which will further drive down costs, which have already fallen 80% over the last few years in the United States. Economic investment and the development of a robust supply chain would drive down the cost of energy even further. And of course, as Hillary Bright will speak to, economic investment from a new industry and supply chain brings jobs, tens of thousands of jobs. My fellow panelists will be digging deeper into this question, but a few examples of what offshore wind could mean for these principles include improving economic participation, such as requiring minority economic participation in offshore wind procurements, lower energy rates with competitive costs, and in many places fixed low rates. Offshore wind will protect consumers from unpredictable price spikes year-round. And offshore wind will also create significant health benefits to residents of our region. A disproportionate number of people of color live near sources of fossil fuel pollution, including power plants. And as more offshore wind comes online, those plants will be able to switch off, eliminating a leading cause of air pollution in overburdened communities. All of this is happening within the context of a booming global market. The first thing to know is that offshore wind is not a new technology. The first project was installed off of Denmark in 1991. There are over 5,000 turbines installed in Europe, and Asia has many as well. The US, meanwhile, has 2 turbines in federal waters and 5 in state waters off of Rhode Island. We've got a long way to go to catch up and compete in this global industry. We're also competing for these resources, investments, and economic benefits within the US. States in New England were first movers in setting targets for offshore wind, but states to our south, particularly New York and New Jersey, have set strong offshore wind targets and economic development provisions to attract the industry to their states, as shown here. We are focused on this regional context because we believe collaboration will not only improve project outcomes, but will also ensure that we maintain leadership in this industry and secure its economic promise in our region so that we can drive a green and just recovery. So now I know you're all wondering how you can get involved. My fellow panelists will dive into more content about just transition principles and how they relate to offshore wind, as well as policy engagement opportunities in New England. And although these examples will be related to Massachusetts and New England, much of the content is broadly applicable to the East Coast of the US, since many of you are in attendance are investors. I'll close my presentation by diving a little deeper into the offshore wind ecosystem so you understand generally what the process is and who the players are that you might be able to influence as you push for principles of racial and economic justice. Offshore wind in the US is predominantly happening in federal waters. This means there's a federal agency in charge of siting, leasing, and permitting of offshore wind projects nationwide. This agency is called the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, or BOEM for short. BOEM has designated these lease areas up and down the East Coast, and they're in the process of designating more off of New York and have started conversations about the Gulf of Maine as well. The permitting process involves a number of environmental reviews and opportunities for public comment. This is one area that people can weigh in. On the right, you'll see that lease areas are leased to specific companies or offshore wind developers. Zooming in a little more on the Massachusetts, Rhode Island wind energy areas, you can see which developers are leasing which sections. Many of these companies are joint ventures or subsidiaries of other larger energy companies in which investors may have holdings. For example, Vineyard Wind is a joint venture of Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners and Avangrid Renewables. Mayflower Wind is a subsidiary of Shell and Ocean Winds, which itself is a recently merged entity of ENGIE and EDPR. Ørsted is the largest offshore wind developer in the world and has a partnership with Dominion in Virginia. Equinor, former Statoil, is in North America, is in partnership with BP. And then there are the utilities. Some examples of how utilities are involved in the US include direct partnership with offshore wind developers and offshore wind projects, such as Eversource with Ørsted, as seen on this map. Participating as quasi-developers of offshore wind, such as Dominion in the south, which is partnering with Ørsted and looking to be a big player in offshore wind. Development of requests for proposals, or RFPs, of offshore wind. In Rhode Island, for example, National Grid is drafting the next RFP, meaning they are defining the standards projects must meet and the criteria by which projects will be evaluated. And project selection. In Massachusetts, National Grid and Eversource not only weigh in on the drafting of the RFP, but they also have a seat on the selection committee, which determines which projects get selected. So with all of this knowledge under your belt, there are many ways you as investors can get involved. These include policy actions at the local, state, and federal levels, advocacy to developers and their partners, as Laura outlined, and advocacy to utilities. My fellow panelists will dig into what equity and economic justice in offshore wind look like, as well as what policy engagement opportunities are on the horizon. So thank you, and I'll look forward to your questions at the end of the session.
Great, thanks very much, Susanna. It's really exciting to hear about the potential of offshore wind, both in terms of decarbonizing the economy, but also the promise it holds out for robust economic development. And I'd now like to pivot to the labor questions really connected with offshore wind, what the promise is. So we'll hear from Hillary Bright with the Blue-Green Alliance, who will talk about the importance of good job standards in this and in the energy transition, and specifically for offshore wind. So Hillary.
Great, thank you, Christina. Thank you to my previous panelists, such a good foundation as I sort of dive into this specific component of offshore wind and economic development, economic justice, and quality job creation. So for those of you who aren't familiar, Blue-Green Alliance, you can see here, we really work with some of America's largest environmental organizations and several labor unions that span the realm of public sector, building trades, and manufacturing. The United Steelworkers, which I will talk about here quite a bit, and the Sierra Club are two of our founding partners when we started about 13 or 14 years ago. And really the goal of maintaining quality jobs and creating more jobs while we build a stronger, fairer economy. And I think we'll see a lot of pieces here as Tamika speaks after me, sort of how we're really trying to tie together these quality jobs with opportunities for a broad range of folks. Okay, so I'm not going to get into detail here. The words on this aren't critically important. I just want to kind of lay out and give you a bit of a visual while I'm talking about this opportunity and what it really means for jobs. So I've been working for about 13, 14 years on the cross-section of labor, energy, and climate solutions. And I will say that this opportunity in offshore wind is legitimately one of the largest at scale climate solutions that I have seen in my career. And we're also seeing the industry really trend in the direction of sort of the quality jobs and the high road jobs. You'll hear lots of different terms, but ultimately sort of family sustaining jobs, careers that we really want to see built out of this space, both for existing unions, members, and workers in the workforce that are potentially being displaced by the transition to a lower carbon future, but then also for communities who have been traditionally left out of this space, and really driving sort of the equity and diversity components of this industry and building it in a little bit of a different way than things have been done in the past. But you can see in this photo a lot of projects in the pipeline, and these projects in the pipeline and now beginning to move through the BOEM permitting process for many of them, as Susanna mentioned, has been really critical to the next steps in building and training up the workforce to service this industry in a host of different ways, not only the construction, which is sort of where I think a lot of folks initially think about these projects. I'm going to start with sort of some of the onshore pieces of this as we look at the various components of offshore wind. So our ports and infrastructure to prepare the coast for what is needed to build and dispatch and fabricate these massive projects, a lot of port upgrades are happening now and need to continue happening. So we're seeing a lot of money going into sort of that section of the industry. Huge opportunities here for, I'll specifically point to Buy American provisions. So you see Buy American provisions on all kinds of infrastructure projects. So you're procuring the materials to do those upgrades or to build out that infrastructure domestically here in the United States. Not many locations currently include ports in that opportunity. But with the level of investment, it's a tremendous chance for our manufacturers like the steelworkers to really begin providing domestically the products that are going into building out these ports, which are critical then to really launching the building and the construction phase of these massive projects. The other piece of this that I think where the conversation is really turning to, as I mentioned, and I'll get into more detail on sort of some of the terms and approaches that are used, but as we're looking at construction, everyone's thinking about getting the steel and the concrete and things in the water, right, to build the actual wind turbines. When we start looking at the opportunities throughout this industry, from ports to supply chain is where I want to take you now. And I've talked for 13 years probably about the importance of trying to build out our domestic manufacturing supply chain on a whole host of renewable energy projects. Offshore wind, I think because of the nature of the conversations that have happened in sort of the preliminary construction development phase that are leaning towards highly unionized jobs, specifically in the building trades, I think that's a combination of factors, from the politics on the East Coast, the union density that we have, and just the workforce opportunity that is needed to build this many projects. Labor unions are sort of right at the forefront of being able to expand their ranks and really bring in a lot more people to getting these high quality careers. And as we look even further upstream at the supply chain piece, so we're talking about the tons and tons of steel, all of the cement, the copper, thousands of component parts that go into a wind turbine. Not all of them have to be built directly at the port. There are smaller components as we look upstream. And this is where I work closely with the United Steelworkers and their manufacturing capacity to begin really working with from the developer level, then working down through the contractors. And you can sort of see how the suppliers, what we call them tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, that ultimately provide all of the different pieces that are needed to get that massive thing built out on the water. So just wanting to sort of expand people's minds when you're thinking about all of the different job opportunities, we're not just limited to construction, or that's not the only focus. We've really got this ports, supply chain, construction, and then after that, operation and maintenance positions as well, which really span a tremendous amount of skills. So when we talk about job quality and labor standards, sort of there are some key provisions here, I think, thinking about, raising labor standards overall, right, to improve wages and benefits, improving access. And this is really where we dive into the equity and diversity components of this work and the opportunity there, making sure that we're providing those career pathways and access to folks. You've got another section of workers that I mentioned, those who will be ultimately displaced as we transition from a fossil-based economy to a low-carbon economy, and really thinking through, some states are better at this than others, working at the federal level as well, but making sure that there are things like pensions and wage support, healthcare. You see time and time again on national studies that jobs and healthcare are sort of the 1 and 2 concerns of every American. So if we want to see the transition as quickly as I think we feel we need to achieve the science that has been laid out to address climate change, we really need to be thinking about those folks who will be displaced and to help address those concerns, so there's just less pushback as we're thinking about new opportunities and the ability to potentially transition people in a much more holistic, fair way than just sort of leaving, saying, well, the change is happening, you have to make this shift and good luck. And that's a very hard way, obviously, to keep, I think, our base of community and climate advocacy together to make the advancement that we need. And then the last thing I'll say on this slide is to really couple, I think, the the communities and workers who are being hardest hit by climate to make sure that they're heavily engaged in receiving those economic benefits and ultimately then the environmental benefits in their local community. So a couple of sort of big overarching themes here when we talk about labor standards. A lot of these will apply to construction, but then also there are specific tactics sort of we utilize for the manufacturing space. So project labor agreements are one of the big sort of you'll hear as you're hearing about the industry developing in the construction trades. So before a contract is signed, there's a negotiation between the developer and the contractors and the labor union then to lay out all of the skills that will be needed, what will need to be delivered to do a timely, efficient, safe project. So huge opportunity there when we're talking about the construction phase. So prevailing wage, another very common term to sort of set the floor of what people will be paid in the industry for the work that they are doing. Really helps to elevate, like I said, sort of the floor without, while providing sort of a fair opportunity for everyone across the board to start at a certain level. A couple other, I think, really huge pieces here that get into the diversity, equity, and inclusion components, as well as the manufacturing space, are a couple of things like local hire, targeted hire, and the ability to organize. So first, local hire, no brainer, right? We really want to see education and opportunity to the communities where a lot of these projects are being built. Targeted hire, we have the opportunity there to specifically pull in groups of folks, minority-owned businesses, women-owned businesses who have potentially a harder time getting into this space, but really elevate that leadership and those folks to be engaging in the industry. And then the last piece, I'll touch on here, the organizing rights, the importance of manufacturers who exist in the United States or those who want to develop in the United States for offshore wind, the ability to fairly organize those workers. So you'll often see, not oftentimes, but you'll see companies who will really try to detract from the ability of the labor union to organize. Literally going in, unions go in, have the conversation, and allow the workers to decide if they want to be a part of a union. Just allowing those sort of conversations and that process to play out presents just a massive opportunity to collectively bargain everything that goes into those sort of organizing contracts, from benefits, wages, sick time, et cetera. Just a huge opportunity to sort of lift a lot of voices. And I would like to take just a few minutes. I'm sorry, there's so much to talk about here, but just to play this.
We're here specifically to showcase not just the construction potential when building, operating, maintaining offshore wind turbines, but the actual manufacturing potential behind it. The hundreds of tons of steel, the thousands of parts and components, the 7 tons of copper. All these things could and should be made in America.
And it puzzles me that it's flying under the radar of what this industry can mean to America and to union organizations. There's a dearth of manufacturing in America. It's interesting that this industry could bring back a brand new type of manufacturing, as much as for my own organization or for the building trades or even for the rest of organized labor. I really want to spread the message that we have to stay on top of this.
It was just so exciting to bring people out and see the inspiration and motivation that comes from seeing these incredible structures built in the water, hearing the stories of how they were developed and constructed with real close engagement with local stakeholders, local labor, and just realizing that this is the beginning of an incredible new energy chapter for the country. As an organization that firmly believes that climate change is our single greatest threat facing wildlife, here in Rhode Island and across the globe, we know we have got to stand up large-scale sources of renewable energy as quickly as their responsible development will allow. And so we are so excited about the incredible and really unparalleled contribution that offshore wind energy can make.
It's very exciting to see that we could potentially be getting more manufacturing into our area and our plant to help build these turbines. They were massive, and it was very exciting to see the production out there and how enormous they are and see them up close.
This is what we need to do as a country, to move forward together, to bring together folks from diverse perspectives and come together around a common goal and really lean in together and make it happen. That's what gives me hope.
Thanks, folks. Just wanted to wrap with that. I hope a little bit of inspiration, but look forward to questions and any other future conversations. Thanks, Christina. Turn it back to you.
That's great. Thanks so much, Hillary. And I really appreciate your highlighting the broader economic opportunity associated with offshore wind, because it's good to be reminded it's not just construction of wind farms, but it's also the supply chain and the economic development potential associated with that. So thanks. And we're going to hear next, picking up on the issue of jobs, from Tamika Jacques, who is Director of Workforce Development at the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center, on how offshore wind can address racial justice issues and benefit low-income communities specifically. So Tamika, I will turn it over to you.
Awesome, thank you. If we can just get the slide changed, I would love for it. Thank you. I think if you can just go back to the first slide. I don't know why, did it skip over? There we go. I'd just like to explain a little bit about Massachusetts Clean Energy Center for those that may not have heard of us. We are an economic development agency. We invest in startups, infrastructure. I'll talk a little bit about how we invest in communities and workforce development, which I am the program director for. And I just want to share with you some things that we are doing at Mass CEC. A lot of people ask a lot of times, you know, how is Mass CEC funded? And we are funded by the ratepayers in Massachusetts. So on every electricity bill, there is a small surcharge on that bill, and some of those funds come into us. Essentially, you know, we are trying to put our own selves out of business, because if you think about offshore wind and other clean energy sectors, the goal is to be able to place this infrastructure in communities and all around Massachusetts, and be able to, you know, get off the grid as we talk about decarbonization. So eventually we'll be putting our own selves out of business, which I think is great news. So the next slide, I will just put that on, as you can see. Susanna and Hillary mentioned our slides are going to look very similar in what I'm going to talk about, but in 2018, Massachusetts did an offshore wind workforce assessment. And so here we were able to see, you know, how many jobs are going to be needed, how many jobs are going to need to be provided, you know, supplied. And we pulled them out. You'll see here we have construction and installation jobs. We have operations and maintenance jobs. And then we were able to look at the economic impact, you know, as well. And so, you know, currently we are always doing workforce analysis, specifically in offshore wind. We have a team that is designated just to offshore wind. And so part of that analysis is looking at, you know, the occupations, how can we map that? And we have a website that soon will include offshore wind. It will show the career pathways. And this website, you know, will show the training and the educational opportunities, and it, you know, it's free for everyone to use. And so I just wanted to point that out. And so, you know, some of that is website will be used as we are identifying and targeting different communities that we want to work with as we talk about energy justice. So next slide, please. So, you know, over the past, since 2018, since we did our workforce analysis, we actually have invested $2 million into workforce training specifically for offshore wind. So I wanted to show this slide just to show our training providers, and many of them will look familiar to who you've worked with, or maybe some you haven't worked with, but I wanted to just show some of the entities that we currently are working with. So in 2019, we awarded $700,000 around workforce training, and in 2020, which was last year, we don't want to talk about that year anymore, but over $1.3 million was awarded. And currently we have a notice of intent where we are asking training providers to tell us how we can focus on energy justice communities, focus on priority populations. And so that will be due to Mass CEC in just a few short weeks. So we are continually investing in offshore wind in Massachusetts specifically. So next slide, please. And so, what does that mean? How do we do it? And I just want to go over a few programs and how, we started, what I feel is important, what needs to happen. And I have here the first piece is awareness, some things that we don't think about when we're talking about energy justice community. I heard, I think it was Hillary or Susanna mentioned the word ports when we, investing in the ports. So, we come into a community and it's important to bring awareness and to know, like, to share that with the communities. This is what's going to be built. This is what's going to be happen. And we have used community groups to get that message across. I know Mass CC held, various forums where people were able to come and give their thoughts on the building of the infrastructure of the port in New Bedford. Our port is located in New Bedford. And so we really tried to spread awareness first and what could come after the awareness. And so when you look at, how do we, support the community? And I put this first because I think it's important to recognize when you do come in an energy justice community or, depending on where a port is built or the jobs around locations, it's important to know who is in your community. It's important to know their skill level, the education level. There is no way that we can go into a community and just say, we have, 30 engineering jobs and we want to employ 30 engineers. It's important to know, when I say skill level, the attainment level, as far as high school dropout rates. These are things to keep in mind as we are planning our initiatives. We want to be able to level up a community. So sometimes it means that you have to invest in remedial programs in order to get someone up to their skill level of where they need to be to have these type of jobs. And so Mass CEC definitely has invested in, as you saw from the previous slide, a lot of those programs that have been invested in are just that. They are programs where we have gone into the communities and we are asking to help us, to join with us and help to level up that community. And so I just wanted to show some present and past initiatives that Mass CEC has worked on. I'm going to discuss them in my few, I know time is running out, so I will be quick, but currently Mass CEC has an internship program, which it's a paid internship program, and we've placed over 4,000 students at clean energy companies across Massachusetts. And the way it works is that, and we do have some participants that are working in offshore wind companies now. The way it works is that a student puts their resume into our database, and companies look in the database and they're able to look at the students that are in the database. Once they select their student, we pay the wages for those students to be at that company for 12 weeks. And essentially a student can go to 3 different companies per year. We run it like a college program, so it's fall, spring, and summer. And we pay the wages up to $7,680 per each student. And, ways that we address diversity and workforce development is, a lot of our companies are founded by startups and people that went to MITs and the Harvards, and we try to educate them to let them know that community college students are just as talented. Students that go to state colleges are just as talented. So we allow companies, if they to take 2 students, we'll pay for 2 students to be at companies, and the 3rd student must be a community college student. So these are ways that we promote, and as I'm not sure if you're familiar, but in Massachusetts, most of our community colleges are located in urban locations. So this kind of taps that talent that otherwise would not have exposure and would not have that opportunity open to them. So the next program that we really talk about working in the community, again, we really partner with our vocational schools in Massachusetts. In Massachusetts, vocational schools, most of them operate when you get to be a junior or a senior. They go to school for a week and then they go to their, they call them co-ops, the co-op the next week. And so we also provide paid co-ops for students to participate in these programs. And again, a lot of vocational schools are located in energy justice communities. So we have been very successful in working with our vocational high schools because we're able again to tap that talent. And when we talk about some of the programs that how we focused on individuals, we had a successful Women in Clean Energy program that just focused on training women around clean energy. And so we were able to invest in these women and partner with them with clean energy employers and pay the wages for them to be there for 6 months. And when I talk about awareness, about investment, it's important that we invest in our younger system. Yes, we know we invest in adult programs, but I think it's important to remember that the K-8 system needs to know the awareness piece of offshore wind. So as investors, it's important to go mentor those high school, those elementary students, which means that we need to go into the schools, and we've provided funding for that as well, where we have put money into providing the equipment for schools to get hands-on learning and being able to allow those students to go visit, you know, onshore wind turbines, but get, you know, educating them about offshore wind. And also, again, looking at our high school programs, we also partner with high schools, again, in those energy justice communities to make sure that those students have a summer job and that they are working at clean energy employers. So, you know, from Mass CEC, it's important that we invest in offshore wind and that, you know, my little joke is womb to tomb. So depending on where you are, if you are in kindergarten, we want to be able to touch you. If you are in 8th grade, we want to be able to have a touch point. If you are in high school, if you are in transition, if you are someone that necessarily does not have the skills, but this is something that you would like to, this is a career path, we want to be able to provide that. So as I speak to everyone on this webinar and investors, it's just important to not only invest in, you know, the career transition, but also invest in the youth, because those really are where the next workforce will come from. So if you have any questions on any of these programs, I am more than welcome to talk about them. I apologize if I went over my time, and thank you so much for listening.
No, you didn't at all. Thanks so much, Tamika. That was great. And it's, you know, it's really good for investors to understand some of what is needed to actually ensure equity for the new jobs that hold out so much promise. So, you know, the practical things you talked about, like paid internships and paid co-op experiences, as well as the focus on targeting equity issues in the pipeline are just so important. So thanks very much. And we're running a little low on time, but I'm going to hand the mic over to John Carlson, who's with the policy team at Ceres to talk about a little bit about the policy needed to make sure all this happens. And then we'll get to a few questions. We have some questions in the Q&A box. If we don't have time to address all of them, we will get answers for you, and they will be shared with everyone who registered for the webinar. So just to let you know that, please put your questions in the Q&A box. And John, over to you.
Thanks, Christina. I appreciate it. I'll endeavor to go as quick as I can so we can squeeze in a few questions. First, I did want to just say, as a graduate of a state university, I want to thank Tamika for highlighting how capable many graduates from those systems are. So there's going to be no shortage of opportunities to engage in public policy to try to push this industry both forward, but also to make it the just industry that we want it to be. Unfortunately, the exact shape and timing of some of those engagements are still up in the air, due in no small part to leftover business from the last legislative session that we're still trying to finish. I'm sure some of you are aware of this and have been tracking it, but just to give a very, very quick rundown of what's going on in Massachusetts legislation at the moment. Combination of how the legislature generally works in Massachusetts and the pressures of COVID last year meant that basically all of the climate legislation got wrapped up into one big omnibus bill, which ended up with the mouthful title of Next Generation Act, Next Generation Roadmap for Massachusetts Climate Policy. The House and the Senate each passed a version of their bill last summer. They then took far too long to come up with a compromise bill, which they released on January 4th, the day before the end of the session, the last day they could legally pass it. They did end up passing it on that day and sending it to Governor Baker. But because the legislative session was over, he wasn't allowed his normal ability to submit amendments. Normally he'd be able to respond, then the legislature would consider it, and there would be a little back and forth. Not having that ability, he decided to veto it. To which the legislature, we think, very appropriately responded once the new session started by refiling word for word the exact bill that they had passed just a few days before and passing it again and sending it to the governor. So the new number and the new version of this bill is Senate Bill 9, and it was sent back to the governor about 2 weeks ago. He had 10 days to respond, which he responded on the last day, which was Sunday afternoon, and released a series of amendments that he would like the legislature to consider. They are actively doing that now. They don't have a set deadline on when they need to respond, but we're hoping it's within the next week or two. And then a final compromise can be reached and we can finally put the lid on the business from last year and move on to more forward-looking public policy. There are some bullet points here that I'm going to skip over because they're not directly applicable to the offshore wind industry, but I will just note that as one provision within that large omnibus bill, it did authorize additional procurements of offshore wind for the state to engage in. It also set an accelerated timeline for when those needed to be finalized. The governor is proposing to do away with that timeline, but they accepted additional procurements. We'll see where negotiations end up. We don't think that's a big problem, especially considering how much is already in the pipeline and how many other things there are to focus on. So we're fingers crossed we're going to have a really good resolution to all of this in the next week or two. Next slide, please. Which brings us to advocacy in the new session, the 192nd legislative session. Normally, bills would need to be filed by the middle of January, but because the previous session went so late, they pushed that back to February 19th to file the bills and even more time to find co-sponsors. So not only did they push up against the end of legally the end of last session, normally they would end it in July. So lawmakers would have over 5 months to kind of develop their thoughts and what they want to advocate for in the coming session. So since all of that is still kind of out there, we don't have exact provisions that I can tell you about now, but I can say that there will be some form of offshore wind legislation. We do know sponsors are interested. We have some idea of what some of the shape of it's going to be, but it's going to be another month at least before we really have hard and fast text. But I think from earlier in this webinar, you've heard some of the things that we want to talk about, right? Making sure that there are labor standards, there's minority participation, that environmental justice is addressed, that a just transition is created. I think we've done a really good job of like raising the ceiling on how many megawatts are going to be procured by the state, but we need to make sure not just that there's this absolute amount of offshore wind being procured, but that it's the right kind of projects that are getting approved. So I know there's only like 2 minutes left, so we're going to go ahead and just skip to the next slide. So to that point, legislation is not the only way that this can happen. Some of this can get contained in the request for proposals that the state puts out when they procure these projects. In fact, one of those RFPs we weren't expecting until next week at the earliest, but actually came out yesterday afternoon. So we are still figuring out exactly how we are going to respond to it, but Massachusetts did release a draft request for proposal for the next solicitation of 1,600 megawatts. They have set a very, very short timeline for written comments of Tuesday, February 23rd. Then they're going to finalize the RFP in May, select projects in December, and the actual, awarding of the contract and approvals from DPU and everything will be some point in early 2022. For the first time, they have included an appendix that lays out a series of criteria on environmental and socioeconomic impacts that they are going to score these proposals on. We are still digging into all the provisions and figuring out exactly what we want to say, but I think you can certainly count on some sort of comment coming from the coalition, and we may work to bring on additional voices. If you do want to engage in that, I don't know that we actually have the time to do a real complete sign-on letter, but you will see my contact information at the end of this presentation. Feel free to reach out to me as we develop what engagements we're going to do. We'll be happy to loop everybody in. And then last slide. So just things that we're going to be tracking. There's a new director at the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. This is the federal bureau that held up the Vineyard Wind permits for the last year. Her name's Amanda Lefton. She was the first Assistant Secretary for Energy and Environment under Andrew Cuomo. I had the pleasure of working with her a little bit, and I'm very excited to have her up there. She immediately reinstated the Vineyard Wind process, which happened much faster than I think even the most optimistic scenarios. So that's going to be great. There's also the New England states are figuring out how to do regional coordination and reform ISO New England to do possible joint procurements. We're going to be watching that. So in all of these venues, we're going to find ways to engage and push public policy in the way we want it. But unfortunately, I don't have exact specifics on what shape that's going to take yet. But be in touch, and we will certainly be in touch with you. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, John. And we're coordinating closely with Ceres on this, especially legislation rolling out in Massachusetts, and we'll continue to work in coalition with the groups that have been on this webinar as the work to decarbonize the economy in a just way moves forward. So thank you. We are out of time, and I'm so sorry because there are a number of really good questions, but our panelists will answer them, and we will share the answers with everyone. There are a number of good questions about relative costs, the numbers of jobs involved, as well as some questions about some technical things, and then thoughts about working with students and prepping students for the new jobs. So thank you so much to everybody, all of our speakers, and all of you, our participants in this. I hope it's been helpful, and we look forward to further work on this. Thanks very much.